In today's conversation, we're going to talk about how do good people become cruel. Most cruel people don't think they're cruel. They think they're right. They think they're defending truth, protecting people. They think they're standing for justice, that they're exposing hypocrisy, resisting evil, and holding people accountable. And sometimes they're dealing with something real. But that's exactly what makes this dangerous because the issue is not whether harm exists. Harm is real, abuse is real, bigotry is real. Exploitation is real. Hypocrisy and corruption is real. The danger begins when we take a real moral concern and use it to make ourselves feel superior to other people. Because once I believe I am right, therefore I am above you, morality stops being a guide for my behavior and becomes a weapon against your humanity. That's how good people become cruel, not because they stopped caring about morality, but because they started using morality as permission to mock, permission to dismiss, permission to dehumanize, permission to lie, permission to slander, permission to destroy, to treat people in ways that they would condemn if the other side did it. And this is not just a religious problem. It's not just a political problem. It's not just a social media problem, a conservative problem, a progressive problem. This is a human problem. So today, I want to talk about moral superiority, purity test, and how communities turn loyalty into a weapon. Because the goal should not be to feel better than most people. The goal should be to become better for people. Let's begin by defining moral superiority, or as I like to call it, moral supremism. Moral superiority is the belief, posture, or performance that says my moral position makes me better than you. It's not the same thing as having strong values. It's not the same thing as believing something is right or wrong. It's not even the same thing as having moral clarity. Moral clarity says this is what I believe is right and this is how I should live. Moral superiority says because I believe what is right, I'm above the people who don't see it the way that I do. That distinction matters because morality is supposed to shape how we treat people. But moral superiority takes morality and uses it to measure whether people deserve to be treated with dignity in the first place. At its core, moral superiority says, because I'm right about this issue, I'm above you as a person. And that's where it gets dangerous. Because once morality becomes a ranking system, compassion starts getting replaced by comparison. A person or group identifies a moral issue, takes the correct side of that issue, and then begins measuring everyone else by how closely they conform to the approved position, approved language, approved tone, approved outrage, approved enemies, and approved social performance. And the issue itself may be completely legitimate. Racism is real, abuse, misogyny, religious trauma, homophobia, transphobia, exploitation, corruption, hypocrisy, harm. All of it is real. So the problem is not that people care. The problem is what happens when caring becomes a competition for status. Because moral superiority can take a real concern and turn it into a social weapon. It can take a legitimate harm and use it to justify illegitimate behavior. It can take the desire to reduce harm and mutate it into the desire to be seen as one of the good people. And once that happens, the question shifts. It's no longer are we becoming more responsible? It becomes who gets to stand above whom. That's how moral superiority works. It doesn't usually begin with cruelty, it begins with certainty, then comparison, then performance, then permission. And once that cycle starts, good people can become cruel while believing they're absolutely innocent. Moral superiority usually develops in stages. It doesn't normally begin with somebody waking up one morning saying, I want to be cruel. It usually starts with something much more reasonable. It starts with caring about something or someone enough to identify with. First, there's moral identification. A person attaches their identity to a moral cause. They don't simply say, I care about justice. They begin to feel, I'm one of the just people. Now, that shift actually matters because once a moral position becomes part of my identity, disagreement no longer feels like disagreement. Nuance no longer feels like nuance. Correction no longer feels like correction. It feels like an attack on my goodness. And this is where so many conversations get hijacked, especially in politics in the US. People are not just debating policies, ideas, values, strategies, or outcomes. They're defending their moral identity. They're defending their status as one of the good ones. So when someone questions the framing, the response is not let's examine the argument. The response becomes, why are you attacking me? Why are you defending them? Why are you not on the right side of this? That's how polarized environments are built, not simply because people disagree, but because disagreement becomes a threat to identity. Now, second, there's moral comparison. Once people identify themselves with the morally correct side, they begin sorting everyone else by distance. How close are you to the right position? How close are you to the right language? How close are you to the right outrage? How close are you to the right enemies? And the further away someone is, the easier it becomes to flatten them. That's when people stop being understood by their full context. Their history doesn't matter as much. Their intentions don't matter as much. Their growth doesn't matter as much. Their fear, ignorance, pain, conditioning, or capacity to change no longer matters as much. They become a category, they become a type, they become one of those people, like astrology. And that feels clarifying. That's why it works. It makes the world easier to understand. It tells us who to trust, who to fear, who to follow, who to dismiss, and who to condemn, like horoscopes. But the cost is human complexity. Moral comparison gives us the feeling of clarity while quietly training us to stop seeing people fully. Third, there's moral performance. At this stage, it's no longer enough to believe the right things. You have to be seen believing the right things. You have to demonstrate that you're on the right side. You have to prove that you belong with the good people. You have to show that you're angry enough, aware enough, loyal enough, publicly aligned enough. And this is where performance can become more important than actual harm reduction. The question shifts from are we helping to are we being seen helping? It shifts from are we becoming more responsible to are we saying the approved things loudly enough? It shifts from are we moving people toward repair, growth, and accountability to are we proving that we're not like them? That's how social media turns morality into theater. This is how we get rage bait. This is how we get virtue signaling. This is how we get people building platforms off suspicion, disgust, contempt, and humiliation while convincing themselves that they're doing something brave. And the algorithm rewards it. Outrage gets rewarded, contempt gets rewarded, certainty gets rewarded, simplifying people into enemies gets rewarded. So people start confusing engagement with impact. But just because something gets clicks doesn't mean it's making people better. Sometimes it's just training people to be cruel with better vocabulary. Lastly, there's moral permission. This is where moral superiority becomes especially dangerous because once someone believes they're morally above another person, they often feel justified in treating that person in ways they would normally consider unethical. They can mock them and call it truth, lie on them, call it justice. They can dehumanize them and call it accountability. They can destroy their reputation and call it protecting the community. And while they do it, they tell themselves they deserve it because they're bad. That's the permission structure. And to be clear, some ideologies do real harm. Some behaviors absolutely need to be confronted. There are systems that need to be challenged, and there are people who need to be resisted or held accountable. But accountability is not the same thing as dehumanization. The danger is when the label becomes a license to stop being honest, stop being fair, stop being humane, to stop caring whether what we're doing is actually ethical. That's one of the greatest contradictions of moral superiority. It gives people permission to behave immorally in the name of morality. This is how people become cruel while believing they're righteous. And this is why identifying moral superiority in religion is not a flex if we can't identify it in ourselves. It's easy to look at religious people and say, look how they use righteousness to justify harm. But can we see it when secular people do it? When political people do it? Can we see it when activists do it? When atheists do it? Can we see it when our own community does it? Can we see it when we do it? Because moral superiority is not just something other people have, it's a temptation inside every human community. And it thrives because it gives us psychological rewards. It gives us certainty in a complicated world. It gives us belonging inside a group. It gives us a villain to focus on, a sense of control, a story where we're the hero. And sometimes it gives us an escape from self examination. Because if the problem is always those people, then I never have to look at myself. And that may be the most addictive part of moral superiority. It allows me to feel morally awake while remaining personally unexamined. One of the most dangerous ways moral superiority operates is through purity testing. A purity test happens when belonging to a group is no longer based on shared values, shared goals, or shared responsibility, but on constant proof that you're loyal enough, angry enough, extreme enough, obedient enough, or publicly aligned enough. It's not enough to care about the issue. You have to care in the approved language. You have to condemn the approved enemies. You have to share the approved outrage. You have to reject the approved people. You have to prove over and over again that you're still one of us. And this is where moral superiority becomes a loyalty weapon. Because once a group believes it occupies the morally superior position, disagreement is no longer treated as disagreement. Questions become betrayal, nuance becomes witness, compassion becomes complicity, boundaries, abandonment. And anyone who refuses to perform loyalty the expected way can be recast as unsafe, compromised, cowardly, or secretly aligned with the enemy. That's how purity tests turn communities into surveillance systems. People stop asking, are we reducing harm? And they start asking, who's still pure enough to belong? And when that happens, the mission gets replaced by maintenance of the in group. The goal is no longer truth, healing, justice, growth, or liberation. The goal is proving allegiance to the group's moral identity. This is especially dangerous because purity tests often disguise themselves as accountability. But accountability is about repair, responsibility, and reducing harm. Purity testing is about ranking, suspicion, and exclusion. Accountability asks what happened, what harm was done, and how do we move responsibly. Purity testing asks, are you still clean enough to stand with? That's why moral superiority can become so toxic. It doesn't just tell people what's right or wrong, it creates a social environment where people are afraid to think, question, grow, or disagree because their belonging is always on trial. This is why moral superiority is not limited to religion. Religion can produce it, absolutely, but so can politics, activism, atheism, academia, social media, nationalism, and any community where people confuse being right with being mature. The opposite of moral superiority is not moral neutrality, it's moral responsibility. Moral responsibility says I can take harm seriously without turning myself into a hero and other people into monsters. It allows us to name what's wrong without pretending we're incapable of being wrong. It allows us to challenge harmful systems without losing sight of human complexity. It allows us to hold people accountable without feeding our ego on their failure. So, moral superiority operates by turning morality into status. Moral responsibility uses morality as a standard for action. That difference absolutely matters because the goal should not be to feel better than people. The goal should be to become better for people. So here's my invitation. Don't let this just be another video you agree with because agreement is easy, reflection is harder, community is harder. Practicing a better way with actual people is harder. If you're tired of the outrage economy, tired of purity tests, people confusing cruelty with courage, and tired of communities that only know how to organize around enemies, then I want you to connect with Bridge City. We're building a post religious, people centered community for people who want to connect better, build better, and learn how to live better with one another. Not perfectly, not performatively, but honestly. So join the global campus today. Take that first step, introduce yourself, and start the onboarding process because moral responsibility doesn't grow in isolation, it grows in community. And if the goal is to become better for people, then we need spaces where people can practice becoming better together. That's all I have for today. Thank you for joining me. And until next time, keep rising.